This is a non-monetized recording of Fancy Showbox, A Morality by Nathaniel Hawthorne, 1836. What is guilt? A stain upon the soul, and it is a point of vast interest whether the soul may contract such stains in all their depth and flagrancy from deeds which may have been plotted and resolved upon, but which physically have never had existence. Must the fleshly hand and visible frame of man set its seal to the evil designs of the soul in order to give them their entire validity against the sinner? Or while none but crimes perpetrated are recognizable before an earthly tribunal, will guilty thoughts, of which guilty deeds are no more than shadows, will these draw down the full weight of a condemning sentence in the supreme court of eternity? In the solitude of a midnight chamber, or in a desert afar from men, or in a church while the body is kneeling, the soul may pollute itself even with those crimes which we are accustomed to deem altogether carnal. If this be true, it is a fearful truth. Let us illustrate the subject by an imaginary example. A venerable gentleman, one Mr. Smith, who had long been regarded as a pattern of moral excellence, was warming his aged blood with a glass or two of generous wine. His children being gone forth about their worldly business, and his grandchildren at school, he sat alone in a deep, luxurious armchair with his feet beneath a richly carved mahogany table. Some old people have a dread of solitude, and when better company may not be had, they rejoice even to hear the quiet breathing of a baby asleep on the carpet. But Mr. Smith, whose silver hair was the bright symbol of a life unstained, except by such spots, nevertheless, either manhood must converse with age, or womanhood must soothe him with gentle cares, or infancy must sport around his chair, or his thoughts will stray into the misty region of the past, and the old man be chill and sad. Wine will not always cheer him. Such might have been the case with Mr. Smith, when through the brilliant medium of his glass of old Madeira he beheld three figures entering the room. These were Fancy, who had assumed the garb and aspect of an itinerant showman with a box of pictures on her back, and Memory in the likeness of a clerk with a pen behind her ear, an inkhorn in her buttonhole, and a huge manuscript volume beneath her arm, and lastly, behind the other two, a person shrouded in a dusky mantle which concealed both face and form. But Mr. Smith had a shrewd idea that it was his conscience. How kind of Fancy, Memory, and Conscience to visit the old gentleman, just as he was beginning to imagine that the wine had never so brightly a sparkle, nor so excellent a flavor as when himself and the liquor were less aged. Through the dim length of the apartment, where crimson curtains muffled the glare of sunshine and created a rich obscurity, these three guests drew near the silver-haired old man. Memory, with a finger between the leaves of her huge volume, placed herself at his right hand. Conscience, with her face still hidden in a dusky mantle, took her station on the left, so as to be next to his heart, while Fancy set down her picture box upon the table, with the magnifying glass convenient to his eye. We can sketch merely the outlines of two or three out of the many pictures which at the pulling of a string successfully peopled the box with the semblances of living scenes. One was a moonlight picture. In the background a lowly dwelling, and in front, partly shadowed by a tree, yet besprinkled with flakes of radiance, two youthful figures, male and female. The young man stood with folded arms, a haughty smile on his lips, and a gleam of triumph in his eyes. He glanced downward at the kneeling girl. She was almost prostrate at his feet, evidently sinking under a weight of shame and anguish, which hardly allowed her to lift her clasped hand in supplication. Her eyes she could not lift, but neither her agony nor the lovely features on which it was depicted, nor the slender grace of the form which it convulsed, appeared to soften the obduracy of the young man. He was the personification of triumphant scorn. Now, strange to say, as old Mr. Smith peeped through the magnifying glass, which made the object start out from the canvas with magical deception, he began to recognize the farmhouse, the tree, and both the figures of the picture. The young man, in times long past, had often met his gaze within the looking-glass. The girl was the very image of his first love, his cottage love, his Martha Burroughs. Mr. Smith was scandalized. "Oh, vile and slanderous picture!" he exclaims. "When have I triumphed over ruined innocence? Was not Martha wedded in her teens to David Tompkins, who won her girlish love and long enjoyed her affection as a wife? And ever since his death she has lived a reputable widow. Meantime, memory was turning over the leaves of her volume, rustling them to and fro with uncertain fingers, until among the earlier pages she found one which had reference to this picture. She reads it close to the gentleman's ear. It is a record merely of sinful thought, which never embodied in an act. But while memory is reading, conscience unveils her face and strikes a dagger to the heart of Mr. Smith. Though not a death blow, the torture was extreme. The exhibition proceeded. One after another, fancy displayed her pictures, all of which appeared to have been painted by some malicious artist on purpose to vex Mr. Smith. Not a shadow of proof could have been adduced in an earthly court that he was guilty of the slightest of those sins which were thus made to stare him in the face. In one scene there was a table set out with several bottles and glasses half filled with wine, which threw back the dull ray of an expiring lamp. There had been mirth and revelry until the hand of the clock stood just at midnight, when murder stepped between the boon companions. A young man had fallen on the floor and lay stone dead with a ghastly wound crushed into his temple, while over him, with a delirium of mingled rage and horror in his countenance, stood the youthful likeness of Mr. Smith. The murdered youth wore the features of Edward Spencer. "What does this rascal of a painter mean?" cried Mr. Smith, provoked beyond all patience. "Edward Spencer was my earliest and dearest friend, true to me as I am to him, through more than half a century. Neither I nor any other ever murdered him. Was he not alive within 5 years, and did he not, in token of our long friendship, bequeath me his gold-headed cane and a mourning ring?" Again had memory been turning over her volume, and fixed at length upon so confused a page that she surely must have scribbled it when she was tipsy. The purport was, however, that while Mr. Smith and Edward Spencer were hearting their young blood with wine, a quarrel had flashed up between them, and Mr. Smith, in deadly wrath, had flung a bottle at Spencer's head. True, it missed its aim and merely smashed a looking-glass, and the next morning, when the incident was imperfectly remembered, they had shaken hands with a hearty laugh. Yet again, while memory was reading, conscience unveiled her face, stuck a dagger to the heart of Mr. Smith, and quelled his remonstrance with an iron frown. The pain was quite excruciating. Some of the pictures had been painted with so doubtful a touch, and in color so faint and pale, that the subjects could barely be conjectured. A dull, semi-transparent mist had been thrown over the surface of the canvas, into which the figures seemed to vanish, while the eye sought most earnestly to fix them. But in every scene, however dubiously portrayed, Mr. Smith was invariably haunted by his own lineaments and various ages, as in a dusty mirror. After poring several minutes over one of these blurred and almost indistinguishable pictures, he began to see that the painter had intended to represent him, now in the decline of life, as stripping the clothes from the backs of 3 half-starved children. "Really, this puzzles me," quoth Mr. Smith, with the irony of conscious rectitude. "Asking pardon of the painter, I pronounce him a fool as well as a scandalous knave. A man of my standing in the world to be robbing little children of their clothes is ridiculous." But while he spoke, memory had searched her fatal volume and found a page which, with her sad, calm voice, she poured into his ear. It was not altogether inapplicable to the misty scene. It told how Mr. Smith had been grievously tempted by many devilish sophistries, on the ground of a legal quibble, to commence a lawsuit against 3 orphan children, joint heirs to a considerable estate. Fortunately, before he was quite decided, his claims had turned out nearly as devoid of law as justice. As memory ceased to read, conscience again thrust aside her mantle, and would have struck her victim with the envenomed dagger, only that he struggled and clasped his hands before his heart. Even then, however, he sustained an ugly gash. Why should we follow fancy through the whole series of those awful pictures? Painted by an artist of wondrous power and terrible acquaintance with the secret soul, they embodied the ghost of all the never perpetrated sins that had glided through the lifetime of Mr. Smith. And could such beings of cloudy fantasy, so near akin to nothingness, give valid evidence against him at the day of judgment? Be that the case or not, there is reason to believe that one truly penitential tear would have washed away each hateful picture, and left the canvas white as snow. But Mr. Smith, at a prick of conscience too keen to be endured, bellowed aloud with impatient agony, and suddenly discovered that his 3 guests were gone. There he sat alone, a silver-haired and highly venerated old man, in the rich gloom of the crimson-curtained room, with no box of pictures on the table, but only a decanter of most excellent Madeira. Yet his heart still seemed to fester with the venom of that dagger. Nevertheless, the old gentleman might have argued the matter with conscience, and alleged many reasons wherefore she should smite him so piteously. Were we to take up this cause, it should be somewhat in the following fashion. The matter with conscience, and alleged many reasons wherefore she should smite him with no pity. Were we to take up his cause, it should be somewhat in the following fashion. A scheme of guilt, till it be put in execution, greatly resembles a train of incidents in a projected tale. The latter, in order to produce a sense of reality in the reader's mind, must be conceived with such proportionate strength by the author as to seem in the glow of fancy more like truth, past, present, or to come, than just purely fiction. The prospective sinner, on the other hand, weaves his plot of crime, but seldom or never feels a perfect certainty that it will be executed. There's a dreaminess diffused about his thoughts in a dream, as it were. He strikes the death blow into his victim's heart, and starts to find an indelible bloodstain on his hand. Thus, a novel writer or a dramatist, in creating a villain of romance and fitting him with evil deeds, and the villain of actual life, in projecting crimes that will be perpetrated, may almost meet each other halfway between reality and fancy. It is not until the crime is accomplished that guilt clenches its grip upon the guilty heart and claims it for its own. Then, and not before, sin is actually felt and acknowledged, and if unaccompanied by repentance, grows 1,000-fold more virulent by its self-consciousness. Be it considered also that men often overestimate their capacity for evil. At a distance, while its attendant circumstances do not press upon their notice, and its results are dimly seen, they can bear to contemplate it. They may take the steps which lead to crime, impelled by the same sort of mental action as in working out a mathematical problem, yet be powerless with compunction at the final moment. They knew not what deed it was that they deemed themselves resolved to do. In truth, there is no such thing in man's nature as a settled and full resolve, either for good or evil, except at the moment of execution. Let us hope, therefore, that all the dreadful consequences of sin will not be incurred unless the act have set its seal upon the thought. Yet, with the slight fancy work which we have framed, some sad and awful truths are interwoven. Man must not disclaim his brotherhood, even with the guiltiest, since though his hand be clean, his heart has surely been polluted by the flitting phantoms of iniquity. He must feel that when he shall knock at the gate of heaven, no semblance of an unspotted life can entitle him to entrance there. Penitence must kneel, and mercy come from the footstool of the throne, or that golden gate will never open. The end. Thank you for listening. I'm Everson Harper.